When we speak of goodness, of virtue, and of moral uprightness, we often imagine a world where doing the right thing inevitably leads to positive outcomes, where kindness is rewarded with gratitude, where honesty is reciprocated with trust, and where integrity becomes the foundation for leadership and success. But as much as these ideals are celebrated in literature, religion, and popular culture, history offers a far more complex and unsettling truth, a truth that the Italian political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli dared to confront with ruthless honesty in a time when idealism often masked brutality, and when virtue, though revered in theory, was frequently discarded in practice. Born during a time of political instability, corruption, and shifting power dynamics in Renaissance Florence, Machiavelli, through his seminal work, The Prince, unveiled a cold and calculated worldview that seemed to many to glorify cunning, manipulation, and even cruelty. Yet at the heart of his argument lies not a celebration of evil, but a harsh illumination of a reality where goodness alone, if not tempered by wisdom and strategic foresight, can lead to ruin rather than reward, where moral purity in the hands of the naive becomes a liability rather than a virtue, and where leadership, in order to survive and be effective, must often embrace what Machiavelli called Virtù, a form of strength that includes decisiveness, boldness, and the willingness to act beyond the bounds of traditional morality when the circumstances demand it. To understand the dark side of goodness, we must first recognize that Machiavelli was not, as is often assumed, an advocate of tyranny or senseless cruelty, but rather a political realist who sought to reveal how power truly functions behind the curtain of noble rhetoric. He observed that those who seek to lead with unflinching honesty, mercy, and trust often fall prey to those who are not bound by the same moral codes, and that the world, governed by self-interest, unpredictable human behavior, and the perpetual struggle for dominance, punishes those who assume that others will behave with fairness and goodwill simply because they themselves do. Thus, Machiavelli warned that a prince who desires to maintain his state must learn how not to be good and to use that knowledge when it becomes necessary, not out of malice, but out of the harsh necessity imposed by the political and human condition. One of Machiavelli's most controversial and oft-quoted assertions is that it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved, if he cannot be both, a statement that challenges the very core of our moral upbringing. Yet within this claim lies a practical insight into the nature of authority and control. For love, while noble and desirable, is fleeting and conditional, subject to the whims of human emotion and changing circumstances, while fear, when wielded wisely and not with cruelty, creates a more stable and predictable form of obedience. This is not to say that Machiavelli promoted terror for its own sake, but rather that he saw fear, moderated and controlled, as a tool that could protect leaders from betrayal and maintain order, in a world where loyalty is fragile and gratitude often short-lived. Machiavelli also confronted the paradox that those who seek to always appear good may, in their attempt to uphold a spotless image, become ineffective and powerless, for the desire to maintain moral perfection often prevents necessary actions, such as punishing wrongdoers, defending the state through deception, or confronting enemies with calculated aggression that may seem unethical in isolation but are essential for the greater good. And in this sense, Machiavelli's philosophy introduces the uncomfortable idea that morality is not an absolute, but a context-dependent strategy where the ends can, at times, justify the means, especially when the survival and stability of the state are at stake. In a world where appearances often matter more than truth, Machiavelli stressed the importance of perception, stating that it is not necessary for a prince to be virtuous, but only to appear virtuous, a principle that resonates deeply in modern politics. corporate leadership and social media culture, where image management often eclipses authentic character, and where leaders, in order to maintain public favor, must master the art of symbolism, narrative, and controlled deception. Yet this emphasis on appearances does not mean that Machiavelli rejected substance entirely, for he also warned that without the strength and intelligence to back up one's image, a ruler would soon be exposed and destroyed, and thus he advocated for a dynamic blend of realism and illusion, where power is sustained through both actual capability and the carefully constructed projection of virtue. What Machiavelli ultimately teaches us is not that goodness is worthless, but that goodness without strength is dangerous, that mercy without discipline invites chaos, and that compassion without discernment can enable evil rather than prevent it. His writings force us to confront the darker side of human nature and to question the comforting narratives that suggest good always triumphs, that truth will always prevail, and that integrity alone is enough to win in a world filled with ambition, deceit, and ruthless competition. This lesson becomes even more relevant in our time, where idealism often collides with political reality, where well-meaning leaders find themselves entangled in bureaucratic stagnation, media manipulation, and adversaries who exploit their principles as weaknesses, and where nations, organizations, and individuals must navigate a complex moral landscape, where the choice is not always between good and evil, but between competing goods, or the lesser of two evils, or even between short-term sacrifice and long-term stability. A reality Machiavelli understood all too well, and one that continues to challenge our understanding of ethics, leadership, and the price of power. Yet Machiavelli was not without hope, for he believed that fortune, though unpredictable, favors those with the courage to act, those who adapt, those who are neither paralyzed by scruples nor seduced by recklessness, but who walk the delicate line between idealism and pragmatism, between virtue and necessity, between the light of noble intention and the shadow of calculated strategy. And in this balancing act, we find the true essence of Machiavellian wisdom. A call not to abandon morality, but to refine it, to ground it in reality, to understand its limits and to wield it with clarity, strength, and the will to do what must be done when the moment demands it. Thus, the dark side of goodness is not a rejection of virtue, but a challenge to our assumptions about what it means to be good in a world that is often anything but. A world where the most compassionate leaders may have to make the harshest decisions, where those who seek peace must sometimes prepare for war, and where survival, justice, and moral clarity demand a deeper, more honest reckoning with the forces that shape human affairs. A reckoning that Machiavelli, with all his brilliance and brutal insight, dared to begin 5 centuries ago, and one that we, in our turbulent age, can no longer afford to ignore. As we delve deeper into Machiavelli's world, it becomes increasingly clear that his message was not intended for the faint-hearted, nor for those who cling blindly to idealistic moral frameworks in the face of complex, real-world dilemmas, but for those who understand that leadership is not a mere extension of personal virtue, but a craft, an art, that requires the capacity to endure moral ambiguity, to make painful decisions under pressure, and to wield both compassion and cruelty. Not arbitrarily, but strategically, always with an eye toward the preservation of the state, the well-being of the people, and the long-term goals that transcend momentary discomfort or public outcry. Indeed, one of the most provocative insights Machiavelli provides is his redefinition of what constitutes virtue, a word that, while etymologically tied to virtue in the classical sense for him, came to signify something much broader and more potent, an amalgamation of courage, shrewdness, resilience, decisiveness, and an almost theatrical mastery of timing and perception. In Machiavelli's eyes, the great leaders of history, figures such as Cesare Borgia or Roman emperors, were not saints, but actors and warriors on the grand stage of politics, able to navigate shifting alliances, unpredictable fortune, and the treacherous terrain of human ambition, not by clinging to a static code of ethics, but by adjusting their tactics fluidly and embracing whatever measures were necessary to secure their position and protect their vision. This vision runs counter to the dominant moral teachings of Machiavelli's time, particularly those rooted in Christian doctrine, which emphasized humility, forgiveness, selflessness, and turning the other cheek. And it is this clash that led many to denounce Machiavelli as a cynic, a corrupter of youth, or even, as some of his critics called him, the devil's advocate. Yet what these detractors often failed to grasp is that Machiavelli was not prescribing evil, but acknowledging the unavoidable presence of it in political life and urging leaders to confront it with eyes wide open rather than being destroyed by a naive insistence that virtue alone is sufficient armor in a brutal and unforgiving world. To illustrate this, consider Machiavelli's distinction between being good and doing good. The former, he suggests, is often a matter of reputation and appearances, something that can be easily manipulated or misunderstood, while the latter requires discernment, sacrifice, and sometimes even the temporary suspension of moral norms in order to prevent greater evils or to secure a more just and stable outcome. In other words, a leader may have to engage in deception to protect the innocent, may have to suppress a rebellion harshly to avoid civil war, or may have to forge alliances with unsavory individuals to achieve a greater peace. Actions that would be condemned in a purely moral vacuum, but which, in context, might serve the higher goal of preserving life, order, and prosperity. This uncomfortable reality forces us to revisit our assumptions about what it truly means to be a good person or a just leader. For Machiavelli teaches us that goodness detached from results is a hollow virtue, that intentions without effective action are as dangerous as open malice, and that the leader who fails to act decisively for fear of being seen as ruthless may ultimately bring about far greater suffering through inaction, indecision, or blind adherence to principle. And here lies one of the central moral tensions in Machiavelli's thought. Is it better to appear good or to do good? In a perfect world, these would be one and the same, but in our world, where perception often overshadows substance and where power attracts both enemies and opportunists, the wise ruler must master both the reality and the image, must learn to act with stealth and precision while maintaining the mask of virtue, not out of duplicity for its own sake, but because without control over appearances, one's noble actions may never be seen, and one's enemies may succeed in rewriting the narrative before the truth can even speak. This duality between public image and private strategy is not only relevant to historical monarchs and princes, but also to contemporary leaders in politics, business, and even social activism, where moral decisions are rarely black and white, and where doing the right thing often means confronting resistance, backlash, or moral compromise. Machiavelli, if read with care, offers not a manual for tyranny, but a toolkit for survival and effectiveness in a morally complex world, where sincerity must be balanced with caution, and where every ideal must be tested against the harsh realities of human nature and historical consequence. It is also crucial to remember that Machiavelli was not a nihilist. He did not believe that anything goes, or that might makes right in every instance. On the contrary, he placed immense value on stability, on civic order, and on a leader's responsibility to serve the greater good. even if doing so required methods that would scandalize conventional morality. In this way, he shares something in common with the tragic heroes of Shakespeare or the flawed protectors in modern literature. Figures who are neither entirely pure nor entirely corrupt, but who carry the burden of leadership with the painful awareness that every decision casts a shadow, and that true greatness lies not in the absence of darkness, but in the willingness to confront it without flinching. Machiavelli's relevance endures precisely because he does not offer easy answers, but difficult questions that force us to look beyond our ideals and into the structure of power itself, to ask what sacrifices we are willing to make for justice, how we define justice in the first place, and whether the leaders we admire are strong enough to protect the values they claim to serve when those values are under threat. In the end, the dark side of goodness is not a call to abandon our principles, but a reminder that principles, to be effective, must be defended, not only with sincerity but with strategy, with an understanding of human psychology, historical pattern, and political necessity, without which even the noblest aims may falter, and the most righteous causes may fall into the hands of those who understand far better than the idealists how the game of power is truly played. As we reflect on the legacy of Machiavelli, we may find ourselves uncomfortable, challenged, even disturbed, but perhaps that is the point, for his writings are not meant to soothe, but to awaken, not to comfort, but to prepare us for a world where goodness is not guaranteed to win, and where virtue, to prevail, must sometimes wear a mask, wield a sword, and walk a path that blends light and shadow into something deeper, something stronger, something real.